sleepyheads. Welcome to another episode of ASMR Storytime, infamous Baltimore. Today, I bring you the story of the Rosewood Center and the shocking story of depravity, of unscrupulous lawyers, and high society snobs that were involved in the center's scandal of the 1920s. The reference articles for this episode come from a 2014 article in Slate from Slate.com, and it was written by author Jesse Baring in an article in the Maryland-based newspaper, The Daily Record, which was written in the same year by Danny Jacobs. That was, some sort of anniversary of the scandal itself. Anyway, so let me break it down to talking about the Rosewood Center itself, and I'll then talk about the Rosewood girls and the aftermath of the scandal, and I'll also sprinkle in there mental health, history of the American society's view on folks living with mental health, but in reality it was the world's view on folks living with mental health that even today we're trying to change through campaigns and talking about it more. And I appreciate everyone speaking about it on podcasts and in TV shows and in movies and things like that. But you gotta understand, it wasn't always like that. And honestly, people only really started talking about mental health openly, about their loved ones living with it, about themselves living with it, in, I would say it feels like we've really been talking about it in the last 10 years, if I'm honest. We know that in the 20s, in the 1900s for sure, there was one point where being gay was considered a mental health condition. No lie, it was in the DSM, the big scientific book of mental health disorders. It was listed there right up until I think the late 70s, something like that, early 80s. And folks that were living with physical disabilities were considered living with a mental health condition, especially if there was a speech impairment, an illness that rendered you unable to communicate verbally, but you were still aware, and whip smart and able to communicate in other ways if only given the option. Like anyone who was undesirable was considered in some way, lashing out in some way was considered to be living with a mental health condition. And if they could, families and friends and people who had the authority to do so would lock folks up and throw away the key. I've seen it depicted in BBC shows, the CBC shows, Canadian television and British television. So that's just the Western world. We know just all over. We know across the globe, folks living with a mental health condition have gotten a raw deal. But anyway, and we're still changing the atmosphere because according to the stats from NAMI.com and other trusted national mental health sources in the United States, 1 in 3 Americans are living with a mental health condition. 1 in 3. Come on. Those numbers aren't. Come on. Anyway, so the story that I'm gonna, talk about is about mental health. And so it's just, our archiving a particularly disturbing slice of time, or at least a disturbing story that probably wasn't atypical, super atypical across the globe, if I'm honest. But a sinister story that comes out of Baltimore. So here it goes. If you are not interested in talking about or listening to true crime, you just want to relax in other ways, I have other videos that you can explore on my page. But if you're into it, if you need something to listen to while you're trying to do a simple task, what have you, or a tedious task, play away. Okay, so the Rosewood Center was located in Owings Mills, which is a suburb just outside of Baltimore. It's just outside of Baltimore. It was a state-run facility for people living with mental health condition, and it opened in 1888 as the Maryland Asylum and Training School for the Feeble-Minded. And so, just like feeble-minded is the term that they used. It's awful, but it was the term that they used. It was a blanket term for everyone who they considered to be living with a mental health condition, but they didn't use those terms. They used other terms, but in this instance, they called it feeble-minded. But again, that's a pejorative term, and we don't use that anymore. And it's a blanket term too. It's just really weird. Okay, so it was a state asylum, opened in 1888. Okay, so now to the Rosewood girls. So in 1937, Leo Kanner, a Johns Hopkins physician, and I'm gonna time jump a little bit, so I've jumped after the scandal, and then I'm gonna jump back into the scandal. Okay. So in 1937, Leo Kanner, a Johns Hopkins physician, as you may be aware, Johns Hopkins is an institution that was started right here in Baltimore. It still exists. There's 3 branches to this major institution that was started by this physician. It's after his death, really. It started as the hospital, which is in East Baltimore on Orleans Street, and then it branched to this is how it went, it branched out to the university which he wanted created, which is in kind of Center City, Charles Village area, but Center City, Center City, almost, not quite, but almost in West Baltimore, but it's really just north central Baltimore. And then Hopkins Bayview, which is a big hospital that's in far east Baltimore, which is on the line between Baltimore City and Baltimore County. Okay, so Leo Kanner, Johns Hopkins physician and widely known as the person who discovered autism, spoke before a crowd at the American Psychiatric Association, retelling the horrible tale of the Rosewood girls. Between 1911 and 1933, young girls and women, some of whom were institutionalized in Rosewood for 40 years by that time, were released and promptly adopted by Baltimore's wealthy families to be kept as servants, thanks to an enterprising Baltimore lawyer by the name of Harry B. Wolfe. How'd he do it? Wolfe used a loophole in the law to cash in on huge paydays. Alright, so now I'm going to use a little bit of legalese. If you're a lawyer, I apologize right now for not explaining this better, but so in Maryland laws, the old judicial writ of habeas corpus, Latin for bring the body judge was on the take, and the lawyer had arranged this relationship with these families. Sometimes the families of, sometimes, speaking of some of the women and girls who were involved, who were used as pawns in this scandal, their families of those who were recently freed would not even have known anything happened at all to their loved ones. And again, go back to the time frame. So many families put their family members in these institutions for the purpose of getting them out of their lives, but also assuaging their guilt by assuring themselves that they would be fed and well taken care of. So in other words, I'm a good person. I can't be seen with this family member who I deem unworthy, and so I'm gonna institutionalize them. So they're gonna get 3 squares a day. They're gonna have a place to lay their head, but I won't have to deal with them outside out of mind. But hey, listen, they're being taken care of, so I'm not a bad person. I'm paying the bill. That was kind of the thinking. And again, we've seen representations of this feeling backed up in many period pieces of the time. We know that the Kennedy's sister, I think her name was Catherine, John F. Kennedy, the American president, and that whole line, I think his sister was living with a mental health condition, and they institutionalized her too, and nobody really talked about her. And it's only much later, probably in the 80s, when mental health, when at least American society began to really talk about mental health openly, still not pillory people who were living with it and kind of ostracize them, but knowing that inhumanely locking people away and forgetting, so locking people away who were quote-unquote undesirable, who weren't deemed to be quote-unquote perfect, but then also the conditions under which these institutions were operated. Like American Horror Story Asylum is based on that premise. Terrible doctors, experiments, throwing family members away, and even American Horror Story, again, some of these fictional stories, the reason why they're so good is because they're based in truth, and the sadism involved in locking away a woman because she was gay was a norm. But anyway, these families, some of the women and girls who were used as pawns in this scheme, their families didn't even know because they hadn't even seen them in probably years. And I think I'll share more later, but they targeted these, I'll share it now, they targeted these women. They targeted the ones whose families weren't coming to see them. They targeted it for whatever reason. Now, it could have been, and I want to be fair, sometimes a person was living with what some folks would consider a serious mental health condition, and their families were, not only were they unequipped to support the child or the person, but they also didn't have any money to have like home care. So there were 2 really big reasons. Either you really couldn't afford to take care of your loved one, or you were embarrassed and you wanted to put them away, which I don't even want to go into. Like, can you even imagine? Because even then, even if you couldn't take care of your loved one, and so you put him in an institution, like Rosewood, these Wolf and his associates, because obviously he wasn't doing it by himself, but mostly Wolf and his people were identifying those who didn't have visitors on purpose, right? So we're like, whatever, we can use these girls that do not matter. And so, yeah, he would. And again, some of these women and girls, well, at this point it's probably women, were in these institutions for 30 years at that point. So if this was the 20s, they had been there since before the turn of the century. Again, the institution opened up in 1888. So, Baltimore is an old city in the United It's actually older than the United States. Sorry, I took my notes. I had my notes and my phone went to sleep and they disappeared for a second. But anyway, so Baltimore is older than the United States, and so there's some pretty old practices, that have been well established in this city. So you kind of know where I'm about to go with the story. But anyway, so okay, so they would take women. They would target women and girls whose families they didn't get too many visits, and so that they could be like, scot-free, and they can go before this judge who was obviously paid off and do this kangaroo court where the judge would deem this woman who was clearly not able to defend herself, speak for herself, sane, so that she could be remanded to custody or released to the custody of these rich people, these rich society people, which, just pausing, Baltimore has some pretty old, rich families. Again, it's an old city, so there's old money in Baltimore. And remember Wallace Simpson, who was blamed for the reason why the heir to the British throne abdicated to be with her, because I don't know why he abdicated out, because he just didn't want to be a part of the family, and it ended up being with her. Well, Wallace was from Baltimore, and she was a divorcee, and she comes from, I don't know that she comes from a super rich family, but she was a socialite, a Baltimore socialite. She actually lived, I think she lived on Charles Street. No, she lived on St. Paul. St. Paul has some of the oldest, most beautiful walk-up apartments and apartment buildings, and houses, like 3-story houses you can imagine. They're comparable with places you can find, old places you can find in New York, any major metropolitan city. They're beautiful. Anyway, but there's a lot of rich old money here, and rich families here, and so the wealthy tended to live downtown because that's where the action was, and only rich people could afford to live downtown, but only in specific spots. Downtown, certainly at the harbor, that was the working harbor. When you watch football, American football, when you watch American football today and you watch the Ravens play, or you watch baseball and you watch the Orioles play, and they show the image of the harbor. The harbor that you're seeing is the tourist harbor. But that was not always the case. That harbor had not been built out to be the tourist harbor. I think that was an invention of the 70s, honestly. That was not always the case, and maybe in the 80s, if I really want to go there, where they started to build out the harbor to make it a tourist attraction. But up until the 80s, it was a working harbor, so there was just industry down in the harbor that you see now. That was just all industry, and so the rich people lived further back. Got off their ships there and all of that stuff in the harbor that you see today, when it was working harbor. So anyway, so the rich people would live near the harbor, but they would live further back, not so as to not be near all the foolishness, but still near major transportation that could get them. They can get on a boat and go to wherever. Anyway, okay, so, but I'm not telling a story about downtown Baltimore. I'm telling a story about the Rosewood Center. So let me tell you what they would do. So between 1911, which apparently is when this thing started, according to the research, between 1911 and 1933, 166 patients were released from Rosewood through this scheme. And this is what they would do. So they would be hired by these rich white families, overwhelmingly white families, to be domestic servants, cheap labor. And so obviously, now check this out. So these women have been institutionalized, many of them living with what we would consider today to be a serious mental health condition. I don't subscribe to serious mental health condition, that phrase, because to the person living with it, everything is a serious mental health condition. Like, anyway, I'm not even gonna go through what would be considered serious versus what is not. To the person living with it, it's pretty serious and it's debilitating. No matter what the diagnosis is, without treatment and care, it's can be pretty limiting for them. So anyway, so some of these women though had cognitive disabilities that they were living with, and so again, some of these women couldn't talk. Some of these women really just couldn't function on their own, and so what we're assuming is that so not only was Wolf and his associates, and obviously he was in league with folks in Rosewood, like staff at Rosewood. So so you've got staff at Rosewood, you've got the judges, you've got the attorneys, and then you've got these families all colluding to take these women and use them as servants, as cheap labor. And so all of these women were initially released under the pretext that they would work in these wealthy people's houses in Catonsville, in Baltimore. Catonsville is another suburb of Baltimore. So Catonsville is just a rich suburb of Baltimore. But yeah, so yeah, they would go to Catonsville, they would go into the city, into these rich people's houses. Anyway, so but the thing about it is, some of these women, like I said, some of these women were living with serious cognitive disabilities, and so when they would not be able to mind the mistress of the home and do the chores that they asked for, when they became too much trouble, these wealthy families would put them out. They would either try to send them back to the asylum, sometimes they would send them back to the asylum, sometimes they would literally just put them on the street again. Because of the time, they would treat these women like they were nothing. Because again, they were, in their mind, imperfect and not worthy of extra care and support. And you know, they were unworthy. Yeah, they were just unworthy of more attention. And they were more of a burden to these rich families, so they put them out. And so, again, some of the women found themselves back, after being put out of these rich families' homes, found themselves back in Rosewood. And some of them were on the street. And so there's a part two to these women being let go, and then being released, and then being used as labor, and then being thrown out on the street. So for the ones that were not put back into Rosewood, unfortunately, they found themselves in some of the seedier parts of Baltimore at the time, which would have been Big Town, mostly Big Town, and around the Fisherman's Wharf, the docks, as prostitutes. And so, which led to a whole nother part, because, well, let me just go through this. So, some of these women ended up being used, because again, cognitive function not super there. They were used by pimps to be pimped out to fishermen on the shore, or not on the shore, but at the harbor. And so, and this happened to 166. Not this entire story. They were not all of the 166 that were released ended up being forced into prostitution. Again, some of them went back to Rosewood, which could have been in its own hell itself. But many of them ended up in prostitution, or dying from exposure on the street. It's super unknown. There was a study done later that tried to track a lot of these folks down, and some of them had children, and some of them diseases, and there was a moment where excuse me, there was my allergies. There was a moment where it was considered whether or not they would round these women up and sterilize them, and I can't, I apologize, but I can't tell you if that actually happened. But what I do know is that some of the children, actually I think it did happen for the ones who had already had kids. They sterilized them, and I think they tried to sterilize their children and cited it as a public health hazard because, again, they saw it was something like a form of eugenics, if I'm honest with you. But anyway, again, another just a terrible slice, just a window into how terrible American society was in this aspect. Now we know American society has a lot of other ways that they're evil and that it's evil and dastardly today, but in this particular way, at least we're not doing this. Well, at least we don't know that folks are actively doing this. And I'm praying there are more controls in place that this just can't happen, or at least can't happen on a large scale and for so long, which is a terrible thing to rationalize. But so let me talk about the aftermath, because I'm going off on a tangent. So let me talk about the aftermath. Wolf was disbarred in 1922 for unrelated charges, so not even for this scheme. Again, shows you how little the American justice system, certainly folks around here in Baltimore and leadership, really cared about these women that they were abusing. And yes, many of them were black. Not all of them, but many were black. Black, white, different ethnicities, because that's Baltimore and always has been. But it was more, I don't think, I can't speak on whether or not they targeted the black ones. I just know that they targeted the ones whose families didn't visit them for whatever reason. Okay, so Wolf was disbarred in 1922 for unrelated charges because at the end of the day he was unscrupulous in so many different ways that he did something else that was probably, I think he was trying to extort a judge, and it caught up to him. His extortion schemes caught up to him. The hospital continued to operate, although the old tricks didn't work anymore. Our society still hid people living with severe physical and mental and undesirable traits as freak and treated them as freaks, until we all know that in the United States, asylums and the asylum culture shifted, and a lot of asylums were emptied. State asylums were emptied, and rules put in place so that they can be more humane, and more controls put in place for families, even ones who couldn't afford for their to really pay for their loved ones' upkeep. There continued to be controversies, although none quite as calculating as forced servitude. But there were issues of staff mistreatment at Rosewood, neglect, poor upkeep, and general facility issues. But even through the 80s, the Rosewood Center still survived, and it finally closed in 2000 due to conditions in the facility. So yeah, I would have thought that a scandal of that magnitude, with both the judges, the facility staff, and lawyers being in collusion to do this to these girls, but no, it was facility management and maintenance, or somewhere on maintenance, that closed the center in 2009. The center is closed, and now another mental health organization resides on the grounds. Obviously, the building's been renovated. I think the original building was raised, and then they built another one on top of it. But yeah, or most of the structure was raised, and they rebuilt on top of it, or used the skeleton to rebuild. But yeah, it wasn't vacant for very long. I think that was rebuilt in 2015. So it wasn't that the space wasn't